There's often a perception that when the British Army went off to war in 1914, that it was entirely commanded by old duffers who knew nothing about modern warfare, didn't see the value in machine guns, and in particular saw no value in aerial observation from aircraft. But the pre-war manoeuvres of 1912 pretty much disproved that. Because in 1912, the Army held its last really big pre-war Army manoeuvres, where two large groups of soldiers came together and war-gamed over a large chunk of the country. And what was particularly interesting in 1912 was that the scenario was loosely based on the plot of a novel. And that was a novel by an author called William Le Queux. In 1906, he'd written this book, The Invasion of 1910. And the basic concept was that the German army had invaded the North Norfolk coast around Weybourne, advanced south through the fens where there was hardly any means of stopping them, and they get all the way into the north of London and are stopped on the north bank of the Thames when the Royal Navy turn up and cut off their supply lines across the Channel. It might seem far-fetched and fanciful, but at the time it was bought by thousands of people and taken very seriously, in particular because Field Marshal Lord Roberts, VC, he was a great supporter. He thought that this was an important work. He'd actually contributed a letter in the Frontier to try and make this seem as realistic as possible, talking about a speech that he'd given in 1905 and making the point that the army needed to be prepared. He was pretty horrified by the fact that the British refused to have conscription, that the British army was still entirely voluntary, unlike virtually every other army in Europe. And so with people like Roberts supporting it, a lot of people started to actually believe this and was taking it very, very seriously indeed. It sold an enormous number of copies. And even after 1910, when that had passed, it was then renamed The Invasion and carried on selling well into the First World War. So in 1912, the manoeuvres were loosely based on the idea that the Red Force, commanded by Douglas Haig, who would later command the British armies in France as Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, he commanded the Red Force as if they were the attackers that had landed in North Norfolk and they were advancing south. His troops are nearly all regular soldiers made up of troops from Aldershot Command, so they're all troops that work together. Defending the Blue Force was Sir James Grierson, Jimmy Grierson, and his troops were made up of the regular 4th Infantry Division, but he then got troops from all other commands around the country, and he got territorials who were part-timers, yeomanry cavalry who were territorial cavalry, if you like, and he then had to sort of use this sort of hodgepodge of soldiers to then defend the area north of London. Sir John French, who would command the army when it first went to France in 1914, he was the chief umpire based in Cambridge, so the Blue Force were loosely based in the area around Cambridge, and as the Red Force came towards the Blue Force, there were various skirmishes, and both sides had a small number of aircraft and balloons to use for observation. And Jimmy Grierson used his to great effect because he was able to see exactly where Douglas Haig's troops were, the routes they were taking, and he decided that the best way to deal with this was to hide his own troops out of the way so they couldn't be seen from the air. So the regular troops of the 4th Division were hidden in ditches and in copses all around the area around Saffron Walden, and other troops were hidden in other areas. So Haig's troops were then advanced to one side, and at the crucial moment the orders were given and the 4th Division attacked from the flank and were deemed to have won. And overall, the exercise was won by Sir James Grierson. Douglas Haig was defeated, which was hugely embarrassing for a man that was going to go on to command the British armies in France. And there was a vital lesson, a really, really important lesson in the value of aerial observation. When the war broke out, the 4th Division were moved to East Anglia because, having pulled off this great stunt in 1912, there was a belief that if the Germans did invade the North Norfolk coast, that 4th Division would know what to do and be ready for them, and they'd be able to repeat their actions. When it became obvious that the Germans were going to be in no position at all to attack the North Norfolk coast because they got their hands full with the French and the Russians, at that point the 4th Division were moved to France and joined the rest of the British Expeditionary Force. Sir John French, as I said, commanded the British armies in France, And Sir James Grierson was the commander of First Corps, but sadly, for somebody who'd been such an important player in the British Army before the war, he'd even written the handbook, the British Army Handbook of the German Army, with as much detail as possible that the British were able to use about the way the German Army operated. But Jimmy Grierson died in a railway carriage of a heart attack on his way to the front. And he was replaced by Douglas Haig, who again in 1915, at the end of 1915, when Sir John French is sent home after a pretty disastrous year, takes over and becomes the commander of the armies in France. But it's just a really, really important lesson that all these years later, it all just seems so simple. But history, as always, is much more complicated than it seems.